you. Hello, and welcome back, dear listeners, to another episode of my classic literature series. Today, we'll be discussing this lovely gentleman here. This is the American author, Jack London. Um, first off, I do want to start with a little bit of blurb about him. Um, Jack London was born here in the US in San Francisco, California. Um, He actually lived a relatively short life, similar to the previous author, Lord Byron, who passed away at 36. Jack London passed away at 40, which hits a little hard since I just had my 40th birthday. He was an American novelist, short story writer. He wrote poems, a number of a number of works. I mean, that it's a little bit of everything. Uh, he was struggling as a young boy. His father deserted his family as he was a roving astrologer. Uh, he was raised by his mother and his stepfather in Oakland, California. He actually took the surname London, um, and before he assumed that name. Like once he actually took that name, he stopped writing under the pseudonym John Griffith Cheney. So that was his pen name was Mr. Cheney. His mother was kind of a well, I'll say it. She was a bit of a hippie, a spiritualist. His stepfather between the two of them, they scraped enough money to take care of Jack. But unfortunately, by the age of 14, um, he felt the need to escape. He actually quit school and wanted to escape being poor and living in poverty, and he wanted to adventure, like all young kids do at some point in their lives. It's like, you know what, I'm going to run away and join the circus, or I'm going to run away and become a sailor, or I'm going to do this grand adventure. And he did it. He actually left his family and started exploring the San Francisco Bay in a sloop. So this 14-year-old boy was just boating around in the bay, um, stealing oysters or working for the government fish patrol, alternating between the two, playing both sides of the coin, stealing the oysters and like, hey, so and so is stealing oysters. You should catch him. He was actually traveled, pretty well traveled. He went to Japan as a sailor, still, in his teens. He did some freight train riding as a hobo with only the clothes on his back and a bag full of belongings, traveling the continental U.S. He actually joined the Charles T. Kelly Industrial Army. He was part of the protesting army of the Coxey Army, and was born during the financial panic of 18 that was born during the financial panic of 1893. So he he saw the worst of the Depression era. Um, During that time, running around as a teenager, he wound up getting jailed for vagrancy. So just lounging around being a unemployed vagrant, he wound up going to jail for it. And in 1894, he actually became a militant socialist. Ah, thank you, Sloppy Fam. So London never finished proper school, so he actually educated himself by going to local libraries. He read the works of Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, a number of other like literary notable authors. By the time he was from 14 to 19, by the time he was 19, he actually crammed a 4-year high school degree or course, like high school education, into 1 year, and then proceeded to join Berkeley, the University of California. He was only in college for about a year before he's like, nah, bruh, this is not for me. I gotta go. And he wound up going north and going up to the Klondike, coming up here to Alaska during the gold rush. So he came up here, he, went gold panning, he went into the wilderness, he sought his fortune, but after a year, he was still poor, unable to find work, and he decided to become a writer. That's quite the journey, in my opinion. He was a sailor, a hobo, um, a Klondike gold panner, and then decided to become a writer. That's an interesting evolution chain. He studied magazines, books, newspapers. He started producing sonnets, ballads, jokes, anecdotes, adventure stories, horror stories, and just started cranking out writing. And that happened through the course of his writing years, which I think was about 20 years of writing. He was just cranking out content because he always spent more, just a little bit more than he made. So he's always eating, hand to mouth. So he always had to rush and always had to like crank out content, which to all of our VTubers and streamer friends, if you're cranking out content just so that you can make money, that's not healthy. And you're going to hurt yourself. And I think you'll put yourself in an early grave like dear Jack London did. So do it for the love of it, not for the money. Uh, he actually started, I think in 1909, he wrote an autobiography. He actually wrote 3 autobiographies because he felt he had enough content, I suppose. The first one was in 1909, titled Martin Eden. And that book kind of launched him because within 2 years of that, his stories of his Alaskan adventures began to circulate and he actually published his first book, The Son of the Wolf, Tales of the Far North, which is a collection of short stories that he had previously published in like magazines and newspapers, and that book gained him a wider audience throughout the world. Um, so from that point on, he just started producing. He actually wrote about 50 books, both fiction and nonfiction, autobiographies and whatnot, um, during that 17-year period that he was still alive. So even though he became the highest paid writer in the entire US, he never was able to meet his expenditures. Like he always lived slightly beyond his means. Which I reiterate, he actually sailed a ketch, which is a type of boat in the South Pacific, and he wound up writing those stories in The Cruise of the Snark in 1911. Uh, he wound up settling in Glen Allen, California, and built a house, a very grandiose, huge house called the Wolf House, and he maintained his socialist belief throughout his life. His hastily written, uneven stories, his output was very highly romanticized. It was full of adventure, and it was consumable to a wider audience, similar to, I feel like, Robertson, Treasure Island. I feel like his work was also just had this grip on you that drove you to want to read more. Um, Welcome in, Minecraft Thing 2121. Let's see. So in 1903 is when he wrote and published The Call of the Wild, which is his first story of his adventures in Alaska, like based on his adventures. The second book is titled White Fang, and that was published 3 years later in 1906. And his last Alaskan wilderness story is Burning Daylight, which was produced in 1910. His short story To Build a Fire in 1908 was also set in the Klondike, but it wasn't a full novel, it was just a short story. And that one actually depicts humankind's inability to overcome nature, and that was reprinted in 1910 as well as part of a larger short story collection called Lost Face. Um, in addition to Martin Eden, his autobiography, hi Danish said, he also wrote the autobiography The Road and John Barleycorn, The Road in 1907 and Barleycorn in 1913. His other important works include The Sea Wolf, which was produced in 1904, which is a Nietzschean Superman hero, Humphrey Van Weyden, and who battles the vicious Wolf Larsen. And then The Iron Heel was written about the future and the terrifying anticipation of fascism in 1908. His reputation kind of declined at the beginning of the World War II due to the new generation of writers. They kind of made it seem like the World War writers, haha, World War I writers seemed to be lacking in sophistication, but his popularity actually skyrocketed, believe it or not, in Russia. So they actually put out a commemorative edition of all of his works in 1956 in Russia, and the entirety of their stock sold out in 5 hours. He's also got a 3-volume set of his letters that were edited by Earl Labor, that was published later in 1988. But the bulk of his work was written, published during the course of his life, which from 1876 to 1916 was hardly any time at all. There's a number of pictures of him. They were actually taking more active photographs during the course of his life. I think one of the most fascinating things that I have found while I was researching him was this beauty. Here is a man, Jack London. So, this is a movie that was produced in 1943 about Jack London's life. Hollywood romanticized the heck out of this man, and they thought he was so fascinating. He was an adventurer from as early as 14 years old. He traveled the Klondike. He wrote amazing stories. He traveled the Pacific. He did what men and children everywhere dream of doing. Um, just pursuing his own adventure. So, this amazing movie was produced, like I said, in 1943. Um, the actor that played Jack London was Michael O'Shea. He's been in a number of works during the 40s as well. He was kind of, the man about town, Um, just absolutely amazing film. Had some pretty important people in it. We had Professor Hillard, Kerwin Maxwell, George Brett, Old Tom were all played by various, like Jonathan Hale, Ralph Morgan, Frank Craven, etc., etc. Just really popular actors of the time. But, yep, I want to showcase this is the cover. This is the actual cover from the 1903 first edition, done in this beautiful fabric hardbound book that was printed with white, red, black ink, and then the embellishment is in uh, gold leaf, gilted gold leaf. So I just thought it was really pretty. And I'll show this at the beginning of pretty much every episode of this, which I don't imagine will be more than two just because it is a rather shorter story. But I've was tinkering around with the idea of reading Wildfang next because it's kind of not a continuation because there's no really through line between the two stories, but they're written about Alaska and it's still winter here and I kind of want to showcase winter in a literary way. So, let's move on to the book. Put this away. Okay. I have the book up and ready, and just as a reminder to all of you lovely listeners, um, if you need to step away, hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, grab a blanket, I'm going to be reading a story. You might as well get comfortable and sit down and just relax. Well, Dosis, I know you've been streaming for the last few hours, so if you need a break, don't hesitate to take care of yourself. Okay. And I think we've got all the pieces that we need to. Okay. The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 1. Into the Primitive. Old longing's nomadic leap, chafing at custom's chain, again from its brumal sleep, wakens the ferine strain. Buck did not read the newspapers, or he would have known that trouble was brewing, not alone for himself, but for every tidewater dog. Strong of muscle and with warm, long hair from Puget Sound to San Diego, because men, groping in the Arctic darkness, had found a yellow metal, and because steamship and transportation companies were booming the find, thousands of men were rushing into the Northland. These men wanted dogs, and the dogs they wanted were heavy dogs with strong muscles by which to toil, and furry coats to protect them from the frost. Buck lived at a big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. Judge Miller's place, it was called. It stood back from the road, half hidden among the trees, through which glimpses could be caught of the wide, cool veranda that ran around its four sides. The house was approached by gravelled driveways, which wound about through wide spreading lawns and under the interlacing boughs of tall poplars. At the rear, things were on even a more spacious scale than at the front. There were great stables, where a dozen grooms and boys held forth rows of vine-clad servants, cottages, an endless and orderly array of outhouses, long grape arbors, green pastures, orchards, and berry patches. Then there was the pumping plant for the artisan well, and the big cement tank where Judge Miller's boys took their morning plunge and kept cool in the hot afternoon. And over this great demesne, Buck ruled. Here he was born, and here he had lived the 4 years of his life. It was true, there were other dogs. There could not but be other dogs on so vast a place. But they did not count. They came and went, resided in the populous kennels, or lived obscurely in the recesses of the house, after the fashion of Toots, the Japanese pug, or Isabel, the Mexican hairless. Strange creatures that rarely put nose out of doors or set foot to ground. On the other hand, there were the fox terriers, a score of them at least, who yelped fearful promises at Toots and Isabel, looking out of the windows at them and protected by a legion of housemaids armed with brooms and mops. But Buck was neither house dog nor kennel dog. The whole realm was his. He plunged into the swimming tank or went hunting with the judge's sons. He escorted Molly and Alice, the judge's daughters, on long twilight or early morning rambles. On wintry nights, he lay at the judge's feet, before the roaring library fire. He carried the judge's grandsons on his back, or rolled them in the grass, and guarded their footsteps through wild adventures down to the fountain in the stable yard, and even beyond, where the paddocks were and the berry patches. Among the terriers he stalked imperiously, and Toots and Isabel he utterly ignored, for he was king. King over all creeping, crawling, flying things of Judge Miller's place, humans included. His father, Elmo, a huge St. Bernard, had been the judge's inseparable companion, and Buck bid fair to follow in the way of his father. He was not so large. He weighed only 140 pounds. For his mother, Shep, had been a Scotch shepherd dog. Nevertheless, 140 pounds, to which was added the dignity that comes of good living and universal respect, enabled him to carry himself in right royal fashion. During the 4 years since his puppyhood, he had lived the life of a sated aristocrat. He had a fine pride in himself, was even a trifle egotistical, as country gentlemen sometimes become because of their insular situation. But he had saved himself by not becoming a mere pampered house dog. Hunting and kindred outdoor delights had kept down the fat and hardened his muscles, and to him, as to the cold tubbing races, the love of water had been a tonic and a health preserver. And this was the manner of dog Buck was in the fall of 1897, when the Klondike strike dragged men from all the world into the frozen north. But Buck did not read the newspapers, and he did not know that Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, was an undesirable acquaintance. Manuel had one besetting sin. He loved to play Chinese lottery. Also, in his gambling, he had one besetting weakness: faith in a system, and this made his damnation certain. For to play a system requires money, while the wages of a gardener's helper do not lap over the needs of a wife and numerous progeny. The judge was at a meeting of the Raisin Growers Association, and the boys were busy organizing an athletic club. On the memorable night of Manuel's treachery, no one saw him and Buck go off through the orchard on what Buck imagined was merely a stroll. And with the exception of a solitary man, no one saw them arrive at the little flag station known as College Park. This man talked with Manuel, and money clinked between them. "You might wrap up the goods before you deliver 'em," the stranger said gruffly. Manuel doubled a piece of stout rope around Buck's neck under the collar. "Twist it, and you'll choke him plenty," said Manuel, and the stranger grunted a ready affirmative. Buck had accepted the rope with quiet dignity. To be sure, it was an unwonted performance, but he had learned to trust in men he knew and to give them credit for a wisdom that outreached his own. But when the ends of the rope were placed in the stranger's hands, he growled menacingly. He had merely intimated his displeasure. Intimated his displeasure, in his pride believing that to intimate was to command. But to his surprise, the rope tightened around his neck, shutting off his breath. In quick rage, he sprang at the man who met him halfway, grappled him close by the throat, and with a deft twist threw him over on his back. Then the rope tightened mercilessly, while Buck struggled in a fury, his tongue lolled out of his mouth and his great chest panting futilely. Never in all his life had he been so vilely treated. And never in all his life had he been so angry. But his strength ebbed, his eyes glazed, and he knew nothing when the train was flagged and the two men threw him into the baggage car. The next he knew, he was dimly aware that his tongue was hurting and that he was being jolted along in some kind of conveyance. The hoarse shriek of a locomotive whistling a crossing told him where he was. He had traveled too often with the judge not to know the sensation of riding in a baggage car. He opened his eyes, and into them came the unbridled anger of a kidnapped king. The man sprang for his throat, but Buck was too quick for him. His jaws closed on the hand. "Oh, thank you, Higara." "Oh, the fallen thespian." "The great choice." The man sprang for his throat, but Buck was too quick for him. His jaws closed on the hand, nor did they relax till his senses were choked out of him once more. "Yep, has fits," the man said, hiding his mangled hand from the baggage man, who had been attracted by the sounds of struggle. "I'm taking him up for the boss to Frisco. A crack dog doctor there thinks that he can cure him." Concerning that night's ride, the man spoke most eloquently for himself in a little shed back of a saloon on the San Francisco waterfront. "All I get is 50 for it," he grumbled, "and I wouldn't do it over for 1,000 cold cash." His hand was wrapped in a bloody handkerchief, and the right trouser leg was ripped from knee to ankle. "How much did the other mug get?" the saloon keeper demanded. 100, was the reply. "Wouldn't take a sow less, so help me." "That makes 150, the saloon keeper calculated, "and he's worth it, or I'm a squarehead." The kidnapper undid the bloody wrappings and looked at his lacerated hand. "If I don't get the hydrophobia, It'll be because you was born to hang, laughed the saloon keeper. Here, lend me a hand before you pull your freight, he added. Dazed, suffering intolerable pain from throat and tongue, with the life half throttled out of him, Buck attempted to face his tormentors. But he was thrown down and choked repeatedly till they succeeded in filing the heavy brass collar from off his neck. Then the rope was removed, and he was flung into a cage-like crate. There he lay for the remainder of the weary night. Nursing his wrath and wounded pride, he could not understand what it all meant. What did they want with him, these strange men? Why were they keeping him pent up in this narrow crate? He did not know why, but he felt oppressed by the vague sense of impending calamity. Several times during the night he sprang to his feet when the shed door rattled open, expecting to see the judge, or the boys, at least. But each time it was the bulging face of the saloon keeper that peered in at him by the sickly light of a tallow candle, and each time the joyful bark that trembled in Buck's throat was twisted into a savage growl. But the saloon keeper let him alone, and in the morning 4 men entered and picked up the crate. More tormentors. Buck decided, for they were evil-looking creatures, ragged and unkempt, and he stormed and raged at them through the bars. They only laughed and poked sticks at him, which he promptly assailed with his teeth till he realized that's what they wanted. Whereupon he lay down sullenly and allowed the crate to be lifted into a wagon. Then he and the crate in which he was imprisoned began a passage through many hands. Clerks in the express office took charge of him. He was carted about in another wagon. A truck carried him with an assortment of boxes and parcels. Upon a ferry steamer, he was trucked off the steamer into a great railway depot, and finally he was deposited in an express car. For 2 days and nights this express car was dragged along at the tail of shrieking locomotives. And for 2 days and nights Buck neither ate nor drank. In his anger he had met the first advances of the express messengers with growls, and they had retaliated by teasing him. When he flung himself against the bars, quivering and frothing, they laughed at him and taunted him. They growled and barked like detestable dogs, mewed and flapped their arms and crowed. It was all very silly. He knew, but therefore the more outrage to his dignity, and his anger waxed and waxed. He did not mind the hunger so much, but the lack of water caused him severe suffering, and fanned his wrath to a fever pitch. For that matter, high-strung and finely sensitive, the ill treatment had flung him into a fever, which was fed by the inflammation of his parched and swollen throat and tongue. He was glad for one thing. The rope was off his neck. That had given him an unfair advantage. But now that it was off, he would show them. They would never get another rope around his neck. Upon that he was resolved. For 2 days and nights he neither ate nor drank, and during those 2 days and nights of torment he accumulated a fund of wrath that boded ill for whoever first fell foul of him. His eyes turned bloodshot, and he was metamorphosed into a raging fiend. So changed was he that the judge himself would not have recognized him, and the express messengers breathed with relief when they bundled him off the train at Seattle. 4 men gingerly carried the crate from the wagon into a small, high-walled backyard. A stout man, with a red sweater that sagged generously at the neck, came out and signed the book for the driver. That was the man, Buck divined, the next tormentor, and he hurled himself savagely against the bars. The man smiled grimly and brought a hatchet and a club. "You ain't going to take him out now?" the driver asked. "Sure," the man replied, driving the hatchet into the crate for a pry. There was an instantaneous scattering of the 4 men who had carried it in, and from safe perches on top the wall they prepared to watch the performance. Buck rushed at the splintering wood, sinking his teeth into it, surging and wrestling with it. Wherever the hatchet fell on the outside, he was there on the inside, snarling and growling, as furiously anxious to get out as the man in the red sweater was calmly intent on getting him out. "Now, you red-eyed devil," he said, when he had made an opening sufficient for the passage of Buck's body, and at the same time he dropped the hatchet and shifted the club to his right hand. And Buck was truly a red-eyed devil, as he drew himself together for the spring, hair bristling, mouth foaming, and a mad glitter in his bloodshot eyes. Straight at the man he launched his 140 pounds of fury, surcharged with pent passion of 2 days and nights. In mid-air, just as his jaws were about to close on the man, he received a shock that checked his body and brought his teeth together with an agonizing clip. He whirled over, fetching the ground on his back and side. He had never been struck by a club in his life and did not understand. With a snarl that was part bark and more scream, he was again on his feet and launched into the air, and again the shock came and he was brought crushingly to the ground. This time he was aware that it was the club, but his madness knew no caution. A dozen times he charged, and as often the club broke the charge and smashed him down. After a particularly fierce blow, he crawled to his feet, too dazed to rush. He staggered limply about, the blood flowing from his nose and mouth and ears, his beautiful coat sprayed and flecked with bloody slaver. Then the man advanced and deliberately dealt him a frightful blow on the nose. All the pain he had endured was as nothing compared with that exquisite agony of this. With a roar that was almost lion-like in its ferocity, he again hurled himself at the man, but the man, shifting the club from right to left, coolly caught him by the underjaw, at the same time wrenching downward and backward. Buck described a complete circle in the air, and half of another, then crashed the ground on his head and chest. For the last time he rushed. The man struck the shrewd blow he had purposely withheld for so long, and Buck crumpled up and went down, knocked utterly senseless. "He's no slouch at dog breaking, that's what I say," one of the men on the wall cried enthusiastically. Druther break cases any day, and twice on Sundays," was the reply of the driver, as he climbed on the wagon and started the horses. Buck's senses came back to him, but not his strength. He lay where he had fallen, and from there he watched the man in the red sweater. "Answers to the name of Buck," the man soliloquized, quoting from the saloon keeper's letter, which had announced the consignment of the crate and contents. "Well, Buck, my boy," he went on in a genial voice, "we've had our little ruction, and the best thing we can do is to let it go at that. You've learned your place, and I know mine. Be a good dog, and all'll go well, and the goose hang high. Be a bad dog, and I'll whale the stuffin' out of you. Understand?" As he spoke, he fearlessly patted the head he had so mercilessly pounded, and though Buck's hair involuntarily bristled at touch of the hand, he endured it without protest. When the man brought him water, he drank eagerly, and later bolted a generous meal of raw meat, chunk by chunk, from the man's hand. He was beaten. He knew that, but he was not broken. He saw once for all that he stood no chance against a man with a club. He had learned the lesson, and in all his afterlife he never forgot it. That club was a revelation. It was his introduction to the reign of primitive law, and he met the introduction halfway. The facts of life took on a fiercer aspect, and while he faced that aspect uncowed, he faced it with all the latent cunning of his nature aroused. As the days went by, other dogs came, in crates and at the ends of ropes. Some docilely, and some raging and roaring as he had come, and, one and all, he watched them pass under the dominion of the man in the red sweater. Again and again, as he looked at each brutal performance, the lesson was driven home to Buck. A man with a club was a lawgiver, a master to be obeyed, though not necessarily conciliated, conciliated, though not necessarily conciliated. Of this last Buck was never guilty, though he did see beaten dogs that fawned upon the man and wagged their tails and licked his hand. Also, he saw one dog that would neither conciliate nor obey, finally killed in the struggle for mastery. Now and again men came, strangers who talked excitedly, wheedlingly, wheedlingly, and in all kinds of fashions to the man in the red sweater. And at such times that money passed between them, the strangers took one or more of the dogs away with them. Buck wondered where they went, for they never came back, but the fear of the future was strong upon him, and he was glad each time when he was not selected. Yet his time came in the end in the form of a little a little weazened man who spat broke English and many strange and uncouth exclamations which Buck could not understand. "Sacre dam!" he cried when his eyes lit upon Buck. "Dat one damn bully dog, eh? How much?" 300 and a present at that, was the prompt reply of the man in the red sweater. "And seem it's government money, you ain't got no kick comin'. Eh, Perrault?" Perrault grinned. Considering that the price of dogs had been boomed skyward by the unwonted demand, it was not an unfair sum for so fine an animal. Hi, Redbeard. The Canadian government would be no loser, nor would its dispatches travel the slower. Perrault knew dogs, and when he looked at Buck, he knew that he was 1 in 1,000. 1 in 10,000, he commented mentally. Buck saw money pass between them, and was not surprised when Curly, a good-natured Newfoundland, and he were led away by the little weazened man. That was the last he saw of the man in the red sweater, and as Curly and he looked at receding Seattle from the deck of the Narwhal, it was the last he saw of the warm Southland. Curly and he were taken below by Perrault and turned over to a black-faced giant named Francois. Perrault was a French-Canadian and swarthy, but Francois was French-Canadian and twice as swarthy. They were a new kind of men to Buck, of which he was destined to see more, and while he developed no affection for them, he none the less grew honestly to respect them. He speedily learned that Perrault and Francois were fair men, calm and impartial in administering justice, and too wise in the ways of dogs to be fooled by dogs. In the 'tween decks of the Narwhal, Buck and Curly joined 2 other dogs. One of them was a big, snow-white fellow from Spitzbergen, who had been brought away by a whaling captain, and who had later accompanied a geological survey into the Barrens. He was friendly in a treacherous sort of way, smiling into one's face the while he meditated some underhand trick, as for instance, when he stole from Buck's food at the first meal. As Buck sprang to punish him, the lash of Francois's whip sang through the air, reaching the culprit first, and nothing remained to Buck but to recover the bone. That was fair of Francois, he decided, and the half-breed began his rise in Buck's estimation. What does that mean? The other dog made no advances, nor received any. Also, he did not attempt to steal from the newcomers. He was a gloomy, morose fellow, and he showed Curly plainly that all he desired was to be left alone, and further, that there would be trouble if he were not left alone. Dave, he was called, and he ate and slept or yawned between times. and took interest in nothing, not even when the narwhal crossed Queen Charlotte Sound and rolled and pitched and bucked like a thing possessed. When Buck and Curly grew excited, half wild with fear, he raised his head as though annoyed, favored them with an incurious glance, yawned, and went to sleep again. Day and night the ship throbbed to the tireless pulse of the propeller, and though one day was very like another, it was apparent to Buck that the weather was steadily growing colder. At last, one morning the propeller was quiet, and the narwhal was pervaded with an atmosphere of excitement. He felt it, as did the other dogs, and knew that a change was at hand. Francois leashed them and brought them on deck. At the first step upon the cold surface, Buck's feet sank into a white, mushy something, very like mud. He sprang back with a snort. More of this white stuff was falling through the air. He shook himself, but more of it fell upon him. He sniffed it curiously, then licked some up on his tongue. It bit like fire, and the next instant was gone. This puzzled him. He tried it again with the same result. The onlookers laughed uproariously, and he felt ashamed, he knew not why, for it was his first snow. I think since I'm due for an ad break here in like 5 minutes, and I'm not going to get through another chapter.
Drink water. Become moist.
Yes. I'm not going to get through another whole chapter, so I'm going to go ahead and take that break now, and then we can read the whole thing in its entirety without interruption. So, 3-minute ad break. I will be right back, and when I get back, we'll read chapter 2. Un momento. It's about 30 seconds before the ad break ends, but I just thought I'd check in and see how everybody's doing, making sure you're taking care of yourself. We are between chapters. Hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack. I have my water available, I have my coffee available, and I have a snack, worst case scenario. Um, Feel free to test out the talk to text or talk to speech or text to speech. There we go, text to speech. Um, I'm pretty sure I've got it up and running now. It should pop up in the middle of my screen rather than overlapping onto me. I also have two new emotes available for everybody that I thought you guys might like. One,
Okay.
oh, yep, he's working. Good work. Thanks, Zed. So I have two new emotes for you guys. So let's see. We have this cute little running back and forth. Um, that one. This is the blanket one that I talked about last stream. So it's cute little me flapping my arms, running back and forth, blanket animated. That was done by Yuki. Amazing artist. I can't get enough. I love their work. I'm as soon as their comms open up again, I'm gonna have to get at least, I don't know, like a dozen more. Something. Then the other one, this one, um, here, post that. This is the Mlem emote. I tried originally posting this as vexing lick emote. Twitch didn't like the name, so they kicked it back on me. So I resubmitted it as Mlem. Um, just the weird tongue back and forth. I don't know. I thought it was cute, so I actually found the template for that one online, and I made that. But I don't need credit because it's just roto tracing and then coloring it in the colors that I like. So not terribly exciting. But we should be back from our ad break right now. Yes, excellent. Um, so let's get started on chapter 2, shall we? Also, you guys, I am so close to 300 followers and I'm shocked because this is the second to the last day of February and I was hoping to maybe see 300 followers sometime at the end of March. So it's been fast. I'm really surprised at the growth and the amount of people that enjoy the reading. Um, yeah, it's exciting. Pretty exciting. The Call of the Wild by Jack London, Chapter 2, The Law of Club and Fang. Wild, you don't have to do it. It'll happen organically, my friend. It's okay. Let's see. Go back to the book. There we go. Chapter 2, The Law of Club and Fang. Um, Before I continue, there was some terminology in that first chapter that I just want to say is antiquated. It's not appropriate, and I didn't catch it before I read it. These terms and turns of phrase are things that I do not use in my everyday language, and I don't condone the use of in modern day use at all. So I literally read it out loud, had to think about what it meant, and then I was like, oh, what does that mean? Oh no, horribly, horribly awry. Yeah, just product of the 1900s. Well, I guess this would be the 18th century, I think. I don't know, I always get confused when it's like a century behind for when it was written. But yeah, for 1903, this is 100 years out of date and definitely not, quote, woke or modern culture. It, not appropriate. Anyway, moving on. The Law of Club and Fang. Buck's first day on the Daiya beach was like a nightmare. Every hour was filled with shock and surprise. He had been suddenly jerked from the heart of civilization and flung into the heart of things primordial. No lazy, sun kissed life was this. with nothing to do but loaf and be bored. Here was neither peace nor rest nor a moment's safety. All was confusion and action, and every moment life and limb were in peril. There was imperative need to be constantly alert, for these dogs and men were not town dogs and men. They were savages, all of them, who knew no law but the law of club and fang. He had never seen dogs fight as these wolfish creatures fought, and his first experience taught him an unforgettable lesson. It is true it was a vicarious experience, else he would not have lived to profit by it. Curly was the victim. They were camped near the log store where she, in her friendly way, made advances to a husky dog the size of a full grown wolf, though not half so large as she. There was no warning, only a leap in like a flash, a metallic clip of teeth, a leap out equally swift, and Curly's face was ripped open from eye to jaw. Oof. It was the wolf manner of fighting, to strike and leap away, but there was more to it than this. 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the combatants in an intent and silent circle. Buck did not comprehend that silent intentness, nor the eager way with which they were licking their chops. Curly rushed her antagonist, who struck again and leaped aside. He met her next rush with his chest in a peculiar fashion that tumbled her off her feet. She never regained them. This was what the onlooking huskies had waited for. They closed in upon her, snarling and yelping, and she was buried, screaming with agony beneath the bristling. Oh man, this got dark quick. Bristling mass of bodies. So sudden was it, and so unexpected, that Buck was taken aback. He saw Spitz run out his scarlet tongue in a way he had of laughing, and he saw Francois swinging an axe, springing into the mess of dogs. 3 men with clubs were helping him to scatter them. It did not take long. 2 minutes from the time Curly went down, the last of her assailants were clubbed off. But she lay there limp and lifeless in the bloody, trampled snow, almost literally torn to pieces. The swart half-breed standing... Ugh. The man standing over her and cursing horribly. The scene often came back to Buck to trouble him in his sleep, so that was the way. No fair play. Once down, that was the end of you. Well, he would see to it that he never went down. Spitz ran out his tongue and laughed again, and from that moment Buck hated him with a bitter and deathless hatred. Before he had recovered from the shock caused by the tragic passing of Curly, he received another shock. Francois fastened upon him an arrangement of straps and buckles. It was a harness, such as he had seen the grooms put on the horses at home, and as he had seen horses work, so he was set to work, hauling Francois on a sled to the forest that fringed the valley, and returning with a load of firewood. Though his dignity was sorely hurt by thus being made a draught animal, he was too wise to rebel. He buckled down with a will and did his best, though it was all new and strange. Francois was stern, demanding instant obedience, and by virtue of his whip receiving instant obedience. While Dave, who was an experienced wheeler, nipped Buck's hindquarters whenever he was in error, Spitz was the leader, likewise experienced, and while he could not always get at Buck, he growled sharp reproof now and again, or cunningly threw his weight in the traces to jerk Buck into the way he should go. Buck learned easily, and under the combined tuition of his two mates and Francois made remarkable progress. Ere they returned to camp, he knew enough to stop at Hoe, to go ahead at Mush, to swing wide on the bends, and to keep clear of the wheeler when the loaded sled shot downhill at their heels. "Three ver good dogs," Francois told Perrault. "Dat Buck him pull like hell. I take him quick as anything." By afternoon, Perrault, who was in a hurry to be on the trail with his dispatches, returned with two more dogs. Billy and Joe, he called them, two brothers, and true huskies both, sons of the one mother, though they were as different as day and night. Billy's one fault was his excessive good nature, while Joe was the very opposite, sour and introspective, with a perpetual snarl and a malignant eye. What a phrase. A sour and introspective, with a perpetual snarl and a malignant eye. Like that phrase is just, yeah, it just rolls off the tongue and it has such a visceral reaction. Buck received them in comradely Buck received them in a comradely that just reads weird. Buck received them in comradely fashion. Dave ignored them, while Spitz proceeded to thrash first one and then the other. Billy wagged his tail appeasingly, turned to run when he saw the appeasement was of no avail, and cried, still appeasingly, when Spitz's sharp teeth scored his flank. But no matter how Spitz circled, Joe whirled around on his heels to face him, mane bristling, ears laid back, lips writhing and snarling, jaws clipping together as fast as he could snap, and eyes diabolically gleaming, the incarnation of belligerent fear. So terrible was his appearance that Spitz was forced to forego disciplining him, but to cover his own discomfiture, he turned upon the inoffensive and wailing Billy and drove him to the confines of the camp. By evening, Perrault secured another dog, an old husky, long and lean and gaunt, with a battle-scarred face and a single eye which flashed a warning of prowess that commanded respect. He was called Sol-leks, which means the angry one. Like Dave, he asked nothing, gave nothing, expected nothing, and when he marched slowly and deliberately into their midst, even Spitz left him alone. He had one peculiarity which Buck was unlucky enough to discover. He did not like to be approached on his blind side. Of this offense, Buck was unwittingly guilty, and the first knowledge he had of his indiscretion was when Sol-leks whirled upon him and slashed his shoulder to the bone for 3 inches up and down. Forever after, Buck avoided his blind side, and to the last of their comradeship had no more trouble. His only apparent ambition, like Dave's, was to be left alone. Mood. Though, as Buck was afterward to learn, each of them possessed one other and even more vital ambition. That night, Buck faced the great problem of sleeping. The tent, illuminated by a candle, glowed warmly in the midst of the white plain, and when he, as a matter of course, entered it, both Perrault and Francois bombarded him with curses and cooking utensils, till he recovered from his consternation and fled ignominiously into the outer cold. A chill wind was blowing that nipped him sharply and bit with especial venom into his wounded shoulder. He lay down on the snow and attempted to sleep, but the frost soon drove him shivering to his feet. Miserable and disconsolate, he wandered about among the many tents, only to find that one place was as cold as another. Here and there savage dogs rushed upon him, but he bristled his neck hair and snarled, for he was learning fast, and they let him go his way unmolested. Finally, an idea came to him. He would return and see how his own teammates were making out. To his astonishment, they had disappeared. Again he wandered about through the great camp, looking for them, and again he returned. Were they in the tent? No, that could not be, else he would not have been driven out. Then where could they possibly be? With drooping tail and shivering body, very forlorn indeed, he aimlessly circled the tent. Suddenly the snow gave way beneath his forelegs and he sank down. Something wriggled under his feet. He sprang back, bristling and snarling, fearful of the unseen and unknown, but a friendly little yelp reassured him, and he went back to investigate. A whiff of warm air ascended to his nostrils, and there, curled up under the snow in a snug ball, lay Billy. He whined placatingly, squirmed and wriggled to show his goodwill and intentions, and even ventured, as a bribe for peace, to lick Buck's face with his warm, wet tongue. Another lesson. So that was the way they did it, eh? Buck confidently selected a spot and, with much fuss and waste effort, proceeded to dig a hole for himself. In a trice, the heat from his body filled the confined space, and he was asleep. The day had been long and arduous, and he slept soundly and comfortably, though he growled and barked and wrestled with bad dreams. Nor did he open his eyes till roused by the noises of the waking camp. At first, he did not know where he was. It had snowed during the night, and he was completely buried. The snow walls pressed on him on every side, and a great surge of fear swept through him, the fear of the wild thing for the trap. It was a token that he was harking back through his own life to the lives of his forebears, for he was a civilized dog, an unduly civilized dog, and of his own experience knew no trap and so could not of himself fear it. The muscles of his whole body contracted spasmodically and instinctively. The hair on his neck and shoulders stood on end, and with a ferocious snarl, he bounded straight up into the blinding day, the snow flying about him in a flashing cloud, ere he landed on his feet. He saw the white camp spread out before him and knew where he was and remembered all that had passed from the time he went for a stroll with Manuel to the hole he had dug for himself the night before. A shout from Francois hailed his appearance. "What I say?" the dog driver cried to Perrault. "Dat buck for sure learn quick as anything." Perrault nodded gravely. As courier for the Canadian government bearing important dispatches, he was anxious to secure the best dogs, and he was particularly gladdened by the possession of Buck. 3 more huskies were added to the team inside an hour, making a total of 9, and before another quarter of an hour had passed they were in harness and swinging up the trail toward the Daia Canyon. Cannon? Buck was Daia Cannon? I don't know. With that inflection there, I'm not sure. Archaic spelling of canyon. Okay, so it's canyon. Canyon. Archaic spelling of canyon. Okay. Towards the Daia Canyon, Buck was glad to be gone, and though the work was hard, he found he did not particularly despise it. He was surprised at the eagerness which animated the whole team and which was communicated to him. But still, more surprising was the change wrought in Dave and Sol-leks. They were new dogs, utterly transformed by the harness. All passiveness and unconcern had dropped from them. They were alert and active, anxious that the work should go well, and fiercely irritable with whatever by delay or confusion slowed that work. The toil of the traces seemed the supreme expression of their being, and all that they lived for, and the only thing in which they took delight. Dave was a wheeler or sled dog. Pulling in front of him was Buck. Then came Sol-leks. The rest of the team was strung out ahead, single file to the leader, which position was filled by Spitz. Buck had been purposely placed between Dave and Sol-leks, so that he might receive instruction. Apt scholar that he was, they were equally apt teachers, never allowing him to linger long in error, and enforcing their teaching with their sharp teeth. Dave was fair and very wise. He never nipped Buck without cause, and he never failed to nip him when he stood in need of it. As Francois's whip backed him up, Buck found it to be cheaper to mend his ways than to retaliate. Once, during a brief halt when he got tangled in the traces and delayed the start, both Dave and Sol-leks flew at him and administered a sound trouncing. The resulting tangle was even worse, but Buck took good care to keep the traces clear thereafter. And ere the day was done, so well had he mastered his work, his mates about ceased nagging him. Francois's whip snapped less frequently, and Perrault even honored Buck by lifting up his feet and carefully examining them. It was a hard day's run, up the canyon through the sheep camp, past the scales and the timberline, across the glaciers and snowdrifts, hundreds of feet deep, and over the great Chilkoot Divide, which stands between the salt water and the fresh and guards forbiddingly the sad and lonely north. They made good time. They made good time down the chain of lakes, which fills the craters of extinct volcanoes, and late that night pulled into the huge camp at the head of Lake Bennett, where thousands of gold seekers were building boats against the breakup of the ice in the spring. Buck made his hole in the snow and slept the sleep of the exhausted just, but all too early was routed out in the cold darkness and harnessed with his mates to the sled. That day they made 40 miles, the trail being packed, but the next day, and for many days to follow, they broke their own trail, worked harder, and made poorer time. As a rule, Perrault traveled ahead of the team, packing the snow with webbed shoes to make it easier for them. Francois, guiding the sled at the gee pole, sometimes exchanged places with him, but not often. Perrault was in a hurry, and he prided himself on his knowledge of ice, which knowledge was indispensable. For the fall ice was very thin, and where there was Swift River, there was no ice at all. Day after day, for days unending, Buck toiled in the traces. Always they broke camp in the dark, and the first gray of dawn found them hitting the trail with fresh miles reeled off behind them. And always they pitched camp after dark, eating their bits of fish and crawling to sleep into the snow. Buck was ravenous. The pound and a half of sun-dried salmon, which was his ration for each day, seemed to go nowhere. He never had enough and suffered from perpetual hunger pangs. Yet the other dogs, because they weighed less and were born to the life, received a pound only of the fish and managed to keep in good condition. He swiftly lost the fastidiousness which had characterized his old life. A dainty eater, he found that his mates finishing first robbed him of his unfinished ration. There was no defending it. While he was fighting off two or three, it was disappearing down the throats of the others. To remedy this, he ate as fast as they, and so greatly did hunger compel him, he was not above taking what did not belong to him. He watched and learned. When he saw Pike, one of the new dogs, a clever malingerer and thief, slyly steal a slice of bacon when Perrault's back was turned, he duplicated the performance the following day, getting away with the whole chunk. A great uproar was raised, but he was unsuspected, while Dub, an awkward blunderer who was always getting caught, was punished for Buck's misdeed. This first theft marked Buck as fit to survive in the hostile Northland environment. It marked his adaptability, his capacity to adjust himself to changing conditions, the lack of which would have meant swift and terrible death. It marked further the decay or going to pieces of his moral nature, a vain thing and a handicap in the ruthless struggle for existence. It was all well enough in the Southland, under the law of love and fellowship, to respect private property and personal feelings, but in the Northland, under the law of club and fang, whoso took such things into account was a fool, and in so far as he observed them, he would fail to prosper. I don't know about the law of club and fang, but I will tell you right now that this idea of fellowship and personal feelings is still frowned upon in a lot of like culture. There's a lot of keep to your own up here. The respect for private property, 100%. Like, mostly because that's enforced by, you know, our laws and whatnot. But this fellowship for mankind and taking care of each other, not so much. Not that Buck reasoned it out. He was fit. That was all, and unconsciously he accommodated himself to the new mode of life. All his days, no matter what the odds. He had never run from a fight, but the club of the man in the red sweater had beaten into him a more fundamental and primitive code. Civilized, he could have died for a moral consideration, say the defense of Judge Miller's riding whip. But the completeness of his decivilization was now evidenced by his ability to flee from the defense of a moral consideration and to save his hide. He did not steal for joy of it, but because of the clamor of his stomach. He did not rob openly, but stole secretly and cunningly, out of respect for club and fang. In short, the things he did were done because it was easier to do them than not to do them. His development, or retrogression, was rapid. His muscles became hard as iron, and he grew callous to all ordinary pain. He achieved an internal as well as external economy. He could eat anything, no matter how loathsome or indigestible, and, once eaten, the juices of his stomach extracted the least particle of nutriment, and his blood carried it to the farthest reaches of his body, building it into the toughest and stoutest of tissues. Sight and scent became remarkably keen, while his hearing developed such acuteness that in his sleep he heard the faintest sound and knew whether it heralded peace or peril. He learned to bite the ice out with his teeth when it collected between his toes, and when he was thirsty there was a thick scum of ice over the water hole. He would break it by rearing and striking it with stiff forelegs. His most conspicuous trait was an ability to scent the wind and forecast it a night in advance. No matter how breathless the air when he dug his nest by tree or bank, the wind that later blew inevitably found him to leeward, sheltered and snug. And not only did he learn by experience, but instincts long dead became alive again. The domesticated generations fell from him. In vague ways he remembered back to the youth of the breed, to the time the wild dogs ranged in packs through the primeval forest and killed their meat as they ran it down. It was no task for him to learn to fight with cut and slash and the quick wolf snap. In this manner had fought forgotten ancestors. They quickened the old life within him, and the old tricks which they had stamped into the heredity of the breed were his tricks. They came to him without effort or discovery, as though they had been his always. And when, on the still cold nights, he pointed his nose at a star and howled long and wolf-like, it was his ancestors, dead and dust, pointing nose at star and howling down through the centuries through him. And his cadences were their cadences, the cadences which voiced their woe and what to them was the meaning of the stiffness and the cold and dark. Thus, as token of what a puppet thing life is, the ancient song surged through him and he came into his own again, and he came because men had found a yellow metal in the north, and because Manuel was a gardener's helper whose wages did not lap over the needs of his wife and divers small copies of himself. Epic. Bit dark there, poor Curly. Sweet girl dog went up to, say hello. And then, yeah. We are between chapters, so as a friendly reminder, hydrate, caffeinate, grab a snack, do whatever it is you need to do to relax and settle in. Um, we're about 35 minutes, give or take, from the next ad break, so we should be able to clear this next chapter pretty easy. If I miss my guess. Yeah, the next chapter is only 15 pages. I don't think we're going to finish this book today. We might finish it on Friday. Um, and then if we do finish that one early, yeah, poor Curly Zed. If we do finish it on Friday, then we'll continue with White Fang, will be the next book, with maybe an intermission or something for an ad break. Let's see here. Chapter 3, The Dominant Primordial Beast. That's a title. The dominant primordial beast was strong in buck, and under the fierce conditions of trail life it grew and grew. Yet it was a secret growth. His newborn cunning gave him poise and control. He was too busy adjusting himself to the new life to feel at ease, and not only did he not pick fights, but he avoided them whenever possible. A certain deliberateness characterized his attitude. He was not prone to rashness and precipitate action. And in the bitter hatred between him and Spitz, he betrayed no impatience, shunned all offensive acts. On the other hand, possibly because he divined in Buck a dangerous rival, Spitz never lost an opportunity of showing his teeth. Oh, thank you, Higara. That's two in one day. My goodness. He went he even went out of his way to bully Buck, striving constantly to start the fight which could end only in the death of one or the other. Early in the trip this might have taken place had it not been for an unwanted accident. At the end of this day they made a bleak and miserable camp on the shore of Lake Lebarge. Driving snow, a wind that cut like a white-hot knife, and darkness had forced them to grope for a camping place. They could hardly have fared worse. At their backs rose a perpendicular wall of rock, and Perrault and Francois were compelled to make their fire and spread their sleeping robes on the ice of the lake itself. The tent they had discarded at Daia in order to travel light. A few sticks of driftwood furnished them with a fire that thawed down through the ice and left them to eat supper in the dark. Close in, under the sheltering rock, Buck made his nest. So snug and warm it was that he was loath to leave it when Francois distributed the fish, which he had first thawed over the fire. But when Buck finished his ration and returned, he found his nest occupied. A warning snarl told him that the trespasser was Spitz. Till now, Buck had avoided trouble with his enemy, but this was too much. The beast in him roared. He sprang upon Spitz with a fury which surprised them both, and Spitz particularly, for his whole experience with Buck had gone to teach him that his rifle was an unusually timid dog, who managed to hold his own only because of his great weight and size. Francois was surprised too, when they shout out in a tangle from the disrupted nest, and he divined the cause of the trouble. Ah, 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 he cried to Buck. Give it to him, by God, give it to him, the dirty thief. Spitz was equally willing. He was crying with sheer rage and eagerness as he circled back and forth for a chance to spring in. Buck was no less eager and no less cautious, as he likewise circled back and forth for the advantage, but it was then that the unexpected happened. the thing which projected their struggle for supremacy far into the future, past many a weary mile of trail and toil. An oath from Perrault, the resounding impact of a club upon a bony frame, and a shrill yelp of pain heralded the breaking forth of pandemonium. The camp was suddenly discovered to be alive with skulking furry forms, starving huskies. 4 or 5 score of them who had scented the camp from some Indian village. They had crept in while Buck and Spitz were fighting, and when the 2 men sprang among them with stout clubs, they showed their teeth and fought back. They were crazed by the smell of food. Perrault found one with head buried in the grub box. His club landed heavily on the gaunt ribs, and the grub box was capsized on the ground. On the instant, a score of the famished brutes were scrambling for the bread and bacon. The clubs fell upon them unheeded. They yelped and howled under the rain of blows, but struggled none the less madly till the last crumb had been devoured. In the meantime, the astonished team dogs had burst out of their nests only to be set upon by the fierce invaders. Never had Buck seen such dogs. It seemed as though their bones would burst through their skins. They were mere skeletons, draped loosely in draggled hides, with blazing eyes and slavered fangs. But the madness made them terrifying, irresistible. There was no opposing them. The team dogs were swept back against the cliff at the first onset. Buck was beset by 3 huskies, and in a trice his head and shoulders were ripped and slashed. The din was frightful. Billy was crying as usual. Dave and Solex, dripping blood from a score of wounds, were fighting bravely side by side. Joe was snapping like a demon. Once his teeth closed on the foreleg of a husky, and he crunched down through the bone. Pike, the malingerer, leapt upon the crippled animal, breaking its neck with a quick flash of teeth and a jerk. Buck got a frothing adversary by the throat and was sprayed with blood when his teeth sank through the jugular. The warm taste of it in his mouth goaded him to greater fierceness. He flung himself upon another, and at the same time felt teeth sink into his own throat. It was Spitz, treacherously attacking from the side. Perrault and Francois, having cleaned out their part of the camp, hurried to save their sled dogs. The wild wave of famished beasts rolled back before them, and Buck shook himself free. But it was only for a moment. The 2 men were compelled to run back to save the grub, upon which the huskies returned to the attack on the team. Billy, terrified into bravery, sprang through the savage circle and fled away over the ice. Pike and Dub followed on his heels, but the rest of the team behind, as Buck drew himself together to spring after them. Out of the tail of his eye he saw Spitz rush upon him with the evident intention of overthrowing him. Once off his feet and under the mass of huskies, there was no hope for him, but he braced himself to the shock of Spitz's charge, then joined the fight out on the lake. Later, the 9 team dogs gathered together and sought shelter in the forest. Though unpursued, they were in a sorry plight. There was not one who was not wounded in 4 or 5 places, while some were wounded grievously. Dub was badly injured in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team at Daia, had a badly torn throat. Joe had lost an eye, while Billy, the good-natured, with an ear chewed and rent to ribbons, cried and whimpered throughout the night. At daybreak, they limped wearily back to camp to find the marauders gone and the 2 men in bad tempers. Fully half their grub supply was gone. The huskies had chewed through the sled lashings and canvas coverings. In fact, nothing, no matter how remotely eatable, had escaped them. They had eaten a pair of Perrault's moose-hide moccasins, chunks out of the leather traces, and even 2 feet of lash from the end of Francois's whip. He broke from a mournful contemplation of it to look over his wounded dogs. "Ah, my friends," he said softly, "maybe it make you mad dog? Dos many bites, maybe all mad dogs. Sacredam, what do you think, Perrault?" The courier shook his head dubiously. With 400 miles of trail still between him and Dawson, he could ill afford to have madness break out among his dogs. 2 hours of cursing and exertion got the harnesses into shape, and the wound-stiffened team was under way, struggling painfully over the hardest part of the trail they had yet encountered, and for that matter, the hardest between them and Dawson. The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild water defied the frost, and it was in the eddies only and in the quiet places that the ice held at all. 6 days of exhausting toil were required to cover those 30 terrible miles. And terrible they were, for every foot of them was accomplished at the risk of life to dog and man. A dozen times, Perrault, nosing the way, broke through the ice bridges, being saved by the long pole he carried, which he so held that it fell each time across the hole made by his body. But a cold snap was on, the thermometer registering 50 below zero, and each time he broke through he was compelled for very life to build a fire and dry his garments. Nothing daunted him. It was because nothing daunted him that he had been chosen for government courier. He took all manner of risks, resolutely thrusting his little weazened face into the frost and struggling on from dim dawn to dark. He skirted the frowning shores on rim ice that bent and crackled underfoot and upon which they dared not halt. Once, the sled broke through with Dave and Buck, and they were half frozen and all but drowned by the time they were dragged out. The usual fire was necessary to save them. They were coated solidly with ice, and the two men kept them on the run around the fire, sweating and thawing so close that they were singed by the flames. At another time, Spitz went through, dragging the whole team after him up to Buck, who strained backward with all his strength, his forepaws on the slippery edge and the ice quivering and snapping all around. But behind him was Dave, likewise straining backward, and behind the sled was Francois, pulling till his tendons cracked. Again, the rim ice broke away before and behind. There was no escape except up the cliff. Perrault scaled it by a miracle, while Francois prayed for just that miracle, and with every thong and sled lashing and the last bit of harness rove into a long rope, the dogs were hoisted, one by one, to the cliff crest. Francois came up last, after the sled and load, then came the search for a place to descend, which descent was ultimately made by the aid of the rope, and night found them back on the river with a quarter of a mile to the day's credit. By the time they made the Hutalinqua, okay. By the time they made the Hutalinqua and good ice, Buck was played out. The rest of the dogs were in like condition, but Perrault, to make up lost time, pushed them late and early. The first day they covered 35 miles to the Big Salmon. The next day, 30 more to the Little Salmon. The third day, 40 miles, which brought them well up toward Five Fingers. Buck's feet were not so compact and hard as the feet of the huskies. His had softened during the many generations since the day his last wild ancestor was tamed by a cave-dweller or river man. All day long he limped in agony, and camp once made lay down like a dead dog. Hungry as he was, he would not move to receive his ration of fish, which Francois had to bring to him. Also, the dog driver rubbed Buck's feet for half an hour each night after supper, and sacrificed the tops of his own moccasins to make 4 moccasins for Buck. This was a great relief, and Buck caused even the weazened face of Perrault to twist itself into a grin one morning when Francois forgot the moccasins and Buck lay on his back, his 4 feet waving appealingly in the air, and refused to budge without them. Later, his feet, Southland dogs he had known. Okay. Later, his feet grew hard to the trail, and the worn-out footgear was thrown away. At the Pelly one morning, as they were harnessing up, Dolly, who had never been conspicuous for anything, went suddenly mad. She announced her condition by a long, heartbreaking wolf howl that sent every dog bristling with fear, then sprang straight for Buck. He had never seen a dog go mad, nor did he have any reason to fear madness, yet he knew that here was horror, and fled away from it in a panic. Straightway he raced, with Dolly panting and frothing one leap behind, nor could she gain on him. So great was his terror, nor could he leave her, so great was her madness. He plunged through the wooded breast of the island, flew down to the lower end, crossed a back channel filled with rough ice to another island, gained a third island, curved back to the main river, and in desperation started to cross it. And at the time, though he did not look, he could hear her snarling just one leap behind. Francois called to him a quarter of a mile away, and he doubled back. Still, one leap ahead, gasping painfully for air, and putting all his faith in that Francois would save him. The dog driver held the axe poised in his hand, and as Buck shot past him, the axe crashed down upon Mad Dolly's head. Buck staggered over against the sled, exhausted, sobbing for breath, helpless. This was Spitz's opportunity. He sprang upon Buck, and twice his teeth sank into his unresisting foe and ripped and tore the flesh to the bone. Then Francois's lash descended, and Buck had the satisfaction of watching Spitz receive the worst whipping as yet administered to any of the team. "One devil dat Spitz," remarked Perrault. "Some damn day him kill dat Buck." "Dat Buck two devils," was Francois's rejoinder. "All de time I watch dat Buck I know for sure. Listen, some damn fine day him get mad like hell and then him chew dat Spitz all up and spit him out on de snow. Sure, I know." From then on, it was war between them. Spitz, as lead dog and acknowledged master of the team, felt his supremacy threatened by this strange Southland dog, and strange Buck was to him, for of the many Southland dogs he had known, not one had shown up worthy in camp and on trail. They were all too soft, dying under the toil, the frost, and starvation. Buck was the exception. He alone endured and prospered, matching the husky in strength, savagery, and cunning. Then he was a masterful dog, and what made him dangerous was the fact that the club of the man in the red sweater had knocked all blind pluck and rashness out of his desire for mastery. He was preeminently cunning, and could bide his time with a patience that was nothing less than primitive. It was inevitable that the clash for leadership should come. Buck wanted it. He wanted it because it was his nature, because he had been gripped tight by that nameless, incomprehensible pride of the trail and trace, that pride which holds dogs in the toil to the last gasp, which lures them to die joyfully in the harness and breaks their hearts if they are cut out of the harness. This was the pride of Dave as wheel dog, of Sol-leks as he pulled with all his strength, the pride that laid hold of them at break of camp, transforming them from sour and sullen brutes into straining, eager, ambitious creatures. The pride that spurred them on all day and dropped. Lost my train of thought there. Welcome in, Defender 1120. Hello, Fox. Agreed. Long time. The pride that spurred them on all day and dropped them at pitch of camp at night, letting them fall back into gloomy unrest and uncontent. This was the pride that bore up Spitz and made him thrash the sled dogs, who blundered and shirked in the traces, or hid away at harness-up time in the morning. Likewise, it was this pride that made him fear Buck as a possible lead dog, and this was Buck's pride, too. He openly threatened the other's leadership. He came between him and the shirks he should have punished, and he did it deliberately. One night there was a heavy snowfall, and in the morning Pike, the malingerer, did not appear. He was securely hidden in his nest under a foot of snow. Francois called him and sought him in vain. Spitz was wild with wrath. He raged through the camp, smelling and digging in every likely place, snarling so frightfully that Pike heard and shivered in his hiding place. But when he was at last unearthed, and Spitz flew at him to punish him, Buck flew, with equal rage, in between. So unexpected was it, and so shrewdly managed, that Spitz was hurled backward and off his feet. Pike, who had been trembling abjectly, took heart at this open mutiny, and sprang upon his overthrown leader. Buck, to whom fair play was a forgotten code, likewise sprang upon Spitz. But Francois, chuckling at the incident, while unswerving in the administration of justice, brought his lash down upon Buck with all his might. This failed to drive Buck from his prostrate rival, and the butt of the whip was brought into play. He half stunned by the blow, Buck was knocked backward, and the lash laid upon him again and again, while Spitz soundly punished the many times offending Pike. Oh, there's so much brutality to dogs in this story. This is rough. In the days that followed, as Dawson grew closer and closer, Buck still continued to interfere between Spitz and the culprits, but he did it craftily when Francois was not around. With the covert mutiny of Buck, a general insubordination sprang up and increased. Dave and Solex were unaffected, but the rest of the team went from bad to worse. Things no longer went right. There was a continual bickering and jangling. Trouble was always afoot, and at the bottom of it was Buck. He kept Francois busy, for the dog driver was in constant apprehension of the life and death struggle between the two, which he knew must take place sooner or later. And on more than one night the sounds of quarreling and strife among the dogs turned him out of his sleeping robe, fearful that Buck and Spitz were at it. But the opportunity did not present itself, and they pulled into Dawson one dreary afternoon, with the great fight still to come. Here were many men and countless dogs, and Buck found them all at work. It seemed that the ordained order of things that dogs should work. All day they swung up and down the main street in long teams, and in the night their jingling bells still went by. They hauled cabin logs and firewood, freighted up to the mines, and did all manner of work that horses did in the Santa Clara Valley. Here and there Buck met Southland dogs, but in the main they were the wild wolf husky breed. Every night, regularly at 9, at 12, at 3, they lifted a nocturnal song, a weird and eerie chant in which it was Buck's delight to join. With the aurora borealis flaming coldly overhead, or the stars leaping in the frost dance, and the land numb and frozen under the pall of snow, this song of the huskies might have been the defiance of life. Only it was pitched in minor key, with long drawn wailings and half sobs, and was more the pleading of life, the articulate travail of existence. It was an old song, old as the breed itself, one of the first songs of the younger world, in a day when songs were sad. It was invested with the woe of unnumbered generations, this plaint by which Buck was so strangely stirred. When he moaned and sobbed, it was with the pain of living that was of old, the pain of his wild fathers, and the fear and mystery of the cold and dark that was to them fear and mystery. and that he should be stirred by it marked the completeness with which he harked back through the ages of fire and roof to the raw beginnings of life in the howling ages. 7 days. From the time they pulled into Dawson, they dropped down the steep bank by the barracks to the Yukon Trail and pulled for Dyea and salt water. Perrault was carrying dispatches, if anything more urgent than those he had brought in. Also, the travel pride had gripped him, and he proposed to make the record trip of the year. Several things favored him in this. The week's rest had recuperated the dogs and put them in through thorough trim. The trail they had broken into the country was packed hard by later journeyers, and further, the police had arranged in 2 or 3 places deposits of grub for dogs and man, and he was traveling light. They made 60 Mile, which is a 50-mile run on the first day, and the second day saw them booming up the Yukon well on their way to Pelly. But such splendid running was achieved not without great trouble and vexation on the part of Francois. The insidious revolt led by Buck had destroyed the solidarity of the team. It was no longer it no longer was one dog leaping in the traces. The encouragement Buck gave the rebels led them into all kinds of petty misdemeanors. No more was Spitz a leader greatly to be feared. The old awe departed, and they grew equal to challenging his authority. Pike robbed him of half a fish one night and gulped it down under the protection of Buck. Another night, Dub and Joe fought Spitz and made him forgo the punishment they deserved. And even Billy, the good-natured, was less good-natured and whined not half so placatingly as in former days. Buck never came near Spitz without snarling and bristling menacingly. In fact, his conduct approached that of a bully, and he was given to swaggering up and down before Spitz's very nose. Welcome in. That is Ethe maybe? If I'm not saying that correctly, I apologize. The breaking down of discipline likewise affected the dogs in their relations with one another. They quarreled and bickered more than ever among themselves, till at times the camp was a howling bedlam. Dave and Solex alone were unaltered, though they were made irritable by the unending squabbling. Francois swore strange barbarous oaths and stamped the snow in futile rage, and tore his hair. His lash was always singing among the dogs, but it was of small avail. Directly his back was turned, they were at it again. He backed up Spitz with his whip, while Buck backed up the remainder of the team. Francois knew he was behind all the trouble, and Buck knew he knew. But Buck was too clever ever again to be caught red-handed. He worked faithfully in the harness, for the toil had become a delight to him. Yet it was a greater delight slyly to precipitate a fight amongst his mates and tangle the traces. At the mouth of the Tahkeena, one night after supper, Dub turned up a snowshoe rabbit, blundered it, and missed. In a second, the whole team was in full cry. 100 yards away was a camp of the Northwest Police, with 50 dogs, huskies all, who joined the chase. The rabbit sped down the river, turned off into a small creek, up the frozen bed of which it was held steadily. It ran lightly on the surface of the snow. While the dogs plowed through by main strength, Buck led the pack, 60 strong, around bend after bend, but he could not gain. He lay down low to the race, whining eagerly, his splendid body flashing forward leap by leap. In the wan white moonlight, and leap by leap, like some pale frost wraith, the snowshoe rabbit flashed on ahead. Yeah, I don't, things don't look good for this rabbit. Not at all. All that stirring of old instincts, which at stated periods drives men out of the sounding cities to forest and plain, to kill things by chemically propelled leaden pellets, the bloodlust, the joy to kill, all this was Buck's. Only it was infinitely more intimate. He was ranging at the head of the pack, running the wild thing down, the living meat, to kill with his own teeth and wash his muzzle to the eyes in warm blood. There is an ecstasy that marks the summit of life, and beyond which life cannot rise. And such is the paradox of living. This ecstasy comes when one is most alive, and it comes as a complete forgetfulness that one is alive. This ecstasy, this forgetfulness of living comes to the artist, caught up and out of himself in a sheet of flame. It comes to the soldier, war mad on a stricken field and refusing quarter, and it came to Buck, leading the pack, sounding the old wolf cry, straining after the food that was alive and that fled swiftly before him through the moonlight. He was sounding the deeps of his nature, and of the parts of his nature that were deeper than he, going back into the womb of time. He was mastered by the sheer surging of life, the tidal wave of being, the perfect joy of each separate muscle, joint, and sinew, in that it was everything was not death, that it was a glow and rampant, expressing itself in movement, flying exultantly under the stars and over the face of dead matter that did not move. But Spitz, cold and calculating even in his supreme moods, left the pack and cut across the narrow neck of land where the creek made a long bend around. Buck did not know of this, and as he rounded the bend, the frost wraith of a rabbit still flitting before him, he saw another and larger frost wraith leap from an overhanging bank into the immediate path of the rabbit. It was Spitz. The rabbit could not turn, and as the white teeth broke its back in midair, it shrieked as loudly as a stricken man may shriek. At sound of this, the cry of life, plunging down from life's apex in the grip of death, the full pack at Buck's heels raised a hell's chorus of delight. Buck did not cry out. He did not check himself, but drove in upon Spitz, shoulder to shoulder, so hard that he missed the throat. They rolled over and over in powdery snow. Spitz gained his feet almost as though he had not been overthrown, slashing Buck down the shoulder and leaping clear. Twice his teeth clipped together like the steel jaws of a trap, as he backed away for better footing, with lean and lifting lips that writhed and snarled. In a flash, Buck knew it. The time had come, it was to the death. As they circled about, snarling, ears laid back, keenly watchful for the advantage, the scene came to Buck with a sense of familiarity. He seemed to remember it all. The white woods, and earth, and moonlight, and the thrill of battle. Over the whiteness and silence brooded a ghostly calm. There was not the faintest whisper of air. Nothing moved, not a leaf quivered, the visible breaths of the dogs rising slowly and lingering in the frosty air. They had made short work of the snowshoe rabbit, these dogs that were ill-tamed wolves, and they were now drawn up in an expectant circle. They, too, were silent, their eyes only gleaming and their breaths drifting slowly upward. To Buck, it was nothing new or strange, the scene of old time. It was as though it had always been the wonted way of things. Spitz was a practice fighter from Spitzbergen, through the Arctic and across Canada and the Barrens. He had held his own with all manner of dogs and achieved to mastery over them. Bitter rage was his, but never blind rage. In passion to rend and destroy, he never forgot that his enemy was in like passion to rend and destroy. He never rushed till he was prepared to receive a rush, never attacked till he had first defended that attack. In vain, Buck strove to sink his teeth in the neck of the big white dog. Wherever his fangs struck for the softer flesh, they were encountered by the fangs of Spitz. Fang clashed fang, and lips were cut and bleeding, but Buck could not penetrate his enemy's guard. Then he warmed up and enveloped Spitz in a whirlwind of rushes. Time and time again he tried for the snow-white throat, where life bubbled near to the surface, and each time and every time Spitz lashed him and got away. Then Buck took to rushing, as though for the throat, when suddenly, drawing back his head and curving in from the side, he would drive his shoulder at the shoulder of Spitz, as a ram by which to overthrow him. But instead, Buck's shoulder was slashed down each time as Spitz leaped lightly away. Spitz was untouched, while Buck was streaming with blood and panting hard. The fight was growing desperate, and all the while the silent and wolfish circle waited to finish off whichever dog went down. As Buck grew winded, Spitz took to rushing, and he kept him staggering for footing. Once Buck went over, and the whole circle of 60 dogs started up, but he recovered. He recovered himself almost in mid-air, and the circle sank down again and waited. But Buck possessed a quality that made for greatness: imagination. He fought by instinct, but he could fight by head as well. He rushed as though attempting the old shoulder trick, but at the last instant swept low in the snow and in. His teeth closed on Spitz's foreleg. There was a crunch of breaking bone, and the white dog faced him on 3 legs. Thrice he tried to knock him over, then repeated the trick and broke the right foreleg. Despite the pain and helplessness, Spitz struggled madly to keep up. He saw the silent circle with gleaming eyes, lolling tongues, and silvery breaths drifting upward, closing in upon him as he had seen similar circles close in upon beaten antagonists in the past. Only this time he was the one who was beaten. There was no hope for him. Buck was inexorable. Mercy was a thing reserved for gentler climbs. He maneuvered for the final rush. The circle had tightened till he could feel the breaths of the huskies on his flanks. He could see them beyond Spitz and to either side, half crouching for the spring, their eyes fixed upon him. A pause seemed to fall. Every animal was motionless, as though turned to stone. Only Spitz quivered and bristled as he staggered back and forth, snarling with horrible menace, as though to frighten off impending death. Then Buck sprang in and out, but while he was in, shoulder had at last squarely met shoulder. The dark circle became a dot on the moon-flooded snow as Spitz disappeared from view. Buck stood and looked on, the successful champion, the dominant, primordial beast who had made his kill and found it good. That was heavy. We are right here, like I'm 50 seconds away from an ad break. I'm going to go ahead and pop away and use the restroom. But I will be right back. So thank you for your patience. We'll get through this ad together, and I'll be right back. Thankfully, humanity has been restored, and I feel much better. Um, we are about not quite halfway through the book, but I think after this next chapter, we'll go ahead and wrap it up for today. That will be half today and then half on Friday. So, yes,
Drink water. Become
become moist. Become moist. Mm-hmm. I did
I
all of
need more
those things.
caffeine. My blood is not thin enough.
Yeah. Sometimes I wonder if you're just doing that to test them out.
Stretch.
Yeah, beefcake. My favorite emote. Yeah. So stretched. Ah, man. Okay. So we return to the next chapter here. So we are on to chapter 4 of. I did not look at that. 4 of 7. And yep. So we'll go ahead and finish chapter 4 and wrap things up. I am surprised. We've already had 4 new listeners come by and drop into the library. This is great. Let's see. We are on to chapter 4. Who has won to mastership? Eh? What I say, I speak true when I say that buck two devils. This was Francois' speech next morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered with wounds. He drew him to the fire and, by its light, pointed them out. Aw, thank you. Welcome in, Fallen Thespian. You had a busy day and a lot of playing Dredge. Can we get a shout out for Fallen Thespian? Introduce them to our community here. Dat Spitz fight laguerre, said Perrault, as he surveyed the gaping ribs and cuts. There it is.
These have been noted in several recent works, which makes study and citation difficult. Some of the older texts have been gnawed at by rats and need to be rebound. Make sure there's no mold in the pages before removing the damaged binding. The mines can be damp in unexpected places. Also put down more poison. The first lot is clearly not working. However, the latest counts of sanguine infusion have been sent to us. It is needed for our research. Repeated use of these infusions seems to have a deleterious
Deleterious mood. I feel that. I'm always struggling over unique and unusual words. Now that's how you don't read on stream. Fair, fair. I don't know. Sometimes you just get caught up in the passion of the moment of the reading itself, and it just pulls you along. And the next thing you know, like, I just read 40 pages in continuity. How did I get here? I don't know. So, luckily though, I've got these kind of naturally inborn hourly breaks, thank you Twitch. So that prevents me from going too off the rails. But man, I tell you, Lord Byron, whoo-wee! That man had some verbose cantos, which, if you haven't checked them out already, the previous VODs, I was reading him last week. Up 7, there should be 7 VODs, because he was a prolific author. Covered a number of his poetries and a couple of his short plays. If I don't read quickly, it makes me yawn, and if I read quickly, I don't say words well. Fair. Fair. Chapter 4. Who has won to mastership? Let's reread it from the top, eh? What I say, I speak true. When I say that Buck two devils. This was Francois's speech next morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered with wounds. He drew him to the fire and by its light pointed them out. Dat Spitz fight la gueule, said Perrault as he surveyed the gaping rips and cuts. And dat Buck fight like two hells, was Francois's answer. And now we make good time. And now we make good time. No more Spitz, no more trouble, sure. While Perrault packed the camp outfit and loaded the sled, the dog driver proceeded to harness the dogs. Buck trotted up to the place Spitz would have occupied as leader, but Francois, not noticing him, brought Solex to the coveted position. In his judgment, Solex was the best lead dog left. Buck sprang upon Solex in a fury, driving him back and standing in his place. Eh? Eh? Francois cried, slapping his thighs gleefully. Look at that, Buck. Him kill that Spitz. Him think he to take this job. Go away, Chook, he cried, but Buck refused to budge. He took Buck by the scruff of the neck, and though the dog growled threateningly, dragged him to one side and replaced Solex. The old dog did not like it, and showed plainly that he was afraid of Buck. Francois was obdurate. But when he turned his back, Buck again displaced Solex, who was not at all unwilling to go. Francois was angry. Now, by gar, I fix you, he cried, coming back with a heavy club in hand. Buck remembered the man in the red sweater, and retreated slowly, nor did he attempt to charge in when Solex was once more brought forward. But he circled just beyond the range of the club, snarling with a bitterness and rage, and while he circled, he watched the club so as to dodge it if thrown by Francois, for he was become wise in the way of clubs. The driver went about his work, and he called to Buck when he was ready to put him in his old place in front of Dave. Buck retreated 2 or 3 steps. Francois followed him up, whereupon he again retreated, and after some time of this, Francois threw down the club, thinking that Buck feared a thrashing. But Buck was in open revolt. He wanted not to escape a clubbing, but to have the leadership. It was his by right. He had earned it, and he would not be content with less. Perrault took a hand. Between them they ran him about for the better part of an hour. They threw clubs at him, he dodged. They cursed him and his fathers and mothers before him, and all his seed to come after him, down to the remotest generation, and every hair on his body, and drop of blood in his veins, and he answered curse with snarl and kept out of their reach. He did not try to run away, but retreated around and around the camp, advertising plainly that when his desire was met, he would come in and be good. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Perrault looked at his watch and swore. Time was flying, and they should have been on the trail an hour gone. Francois scratched his head again. He shook it and grinned sheepishly at the courier, who shrugged his shoulders in sign that they were beaten. Then Francois went up to where Solex stood and called to Buck. Buck laughed as dogs laugh, yet kept his distance. Francois unfastened Solex's traces and put him back in his old place. The team stood harnessed to the sled in an unbroken line, ready for the trail. There was no place for Buck, save at the front. Once more Francois called, and once more Buck laughed and kept away. Throw down de club, Perrault commanded. Francois complied, whereupon Buck trotted in, laughing triumphantly, and swung around into position at the head of the team. His traces were fastened. The sled broke out, and with both men running, they dashed out on the river trail. Highly as the dog driver had forevalued Buck, with his 2 devils he found, while the day was yet young, that he had undervalued. At a bound, Buck took up the duties of leadership, and where judgment was required and quick thinking and quick acting, he showed himself the superior even of Spitz, of whom Francois had never seen an equal. But it was in giving the law and making his mates live up to it that Buck excelled. Dave and Sol-leks did not mind the change in leadership. It was none of their business. Their business was to toil, and toil mightily, in the traces. So long as that were not interfered with, they did not care what happened. Billy, the good-natured, could lead for all they cared, so long as he kept order. The rest of the team, however, had grown unruly during the last days of Spitz, and their surprise was great now that Buck proceeded to lick them into shape. Pike, who pulled at Buck's heels, and who never put an ounce more of his weight against the breastband than he was compelled to do, was swiftly and repeatedly shaken for loafing, and ere the first day was done he was pulling more than ever before in his life. The first night in camp, Joe, the sour one, was punished roundly, a thing that Spitz had never succeeded in doing. Bucks simply smothered him by virtue of superior weight and cut him up till he ceased snapping and began to whine for mercy. I just imagine him sitting on that poor husky, just like, no, you will listen. Just smush you by virtue of being so heavy. The general tone of the team picked up immediately. It recovered its old-time solidarity, and once more the dogs leaped as one dog in the traces. At the rink rapids, 2 native huskies, Teak and Kuna, were added, and the celerity with which Buck broke them in took away Francois's breath. "Never such a dog as that, Buck," he cried. "No, never. Him worth $1,000, by gar, eh? What do you say, Perrault?" And Perrault nodded. He was size manners. Okay. He was ahead of the record then, and gaining day by day. The trail was in excellent condition, well packed and hard, and there was no new fallen snow with which to contend. It was not too cold. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero, and remained there the whole trip. The men rode and ran by turn, and the dogs were kept on the jump, with but infrequent stoppages. The 30-mile river was comparatively coated with ice, and they covered it in one day going out, what had taken them 10 days coming in. In one run they made a 60-mile dash from the foot of Lake Labarge to the White Horse Rapids, across Marsh, Tagish, and Bennett. 70 miles of lakes. They flew so fast that the man whose turn it was to run towed behind the sled at the end of a rope. And on the last night of the second week they topped White Pass and dropped down the sea slope with the lights of Skagway, and of the shipping at their feet. It was a record run. Each day for 14 days they had averaged 40 miles. For 3 days Perrault and Francois threw chests up and down the main street of Skagway, and were deluged with invitations to drink, while the team was the constant center of a worshipful crowd of dog-busters and mushers. Then 3 or 4 Western bad men aspired to clean out the town, were riddled like pepper boxes for their pains, and public interest turned to other idols. Next came official orders. Francois called Buck to him, threw his arms around him, wept over him, and that was the last of Francois and Perrault. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life for good. A Scotchman took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back over the weary trail to Dawson. It was no light running now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day, with a heavy load behind, for this was the mail train, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. Buck did not like it, but he bore up well to the work, taking pride in it after the manner of Dave and Sol-leks, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided in it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life, operating with machine-like regularity. One day was very like another. At a certain time each morning the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were under way an hour or so before the darkness fell, which gave warning of dawn. At night, camp was made. Some pitched the flies, others cut firewood and pine boughs for the beds, and still others carried water or ice for the cooks. Also, the dogs were fed. To them, this was the one feature of the day, though it was good to loaf around after the fish was eaten for an hour or so with the other dogs, of which there were 50 and odd. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of his way. Best of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire, hind legs crouched under him, forelegs stretched out in front, head raised and eyes blinking dreamily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of the cement swimming tank, and Isabel the Mexican hairless, and Toots the Japanese pug. But oftener he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The sunland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. Far more potent were the memories of his heredity, that gave things he had never seen before a seeming familiarity. The instincts, which were but the memories of his ancestors, become habits, which had lapsed in later days, and still later, in him quickened and become alive again. Sometimes, as he crouched there, blinking dreamily at the flames, it seemed that the flames were of another fire, and that as he crouched by this other fire, he saw another and different man from the cook before him. This other man was shorter of leg and longer of arm, with muscles that were stringy and knotty rather than rounded and swelling. The hair of this man was long and matted, and his head slanted back under from the eyes. He uttered strange sounds, and seemed very much afraid of the darkness, into which he peered continually, clutching in his hand, which hung midway between knee and foot, a stick with a heavy stone made fast to the end. He was all but naked, a ragged and fire-scorched skin hanging part way down his back. But on his body there was much hair, in some places across the chest and shoulders, and down the outside of the arms and thighs. It was matted into almost a thick fur. He did not stand erect, but with trunk inclined forward from the hips, and legs that bent on the knees. About his body there was a peculiar springiness or resiliency, almost cat-like, and a quick alertness as of one who lived in perpetual fear of things seen and unseen. At other times this hairy man squatted by the fire with head between his legs and slept. On such occasions his elbows were on his knees, his hands clasped above his head as though to shed rain by the hairy arms. And beyond that fire, in the circling darkness, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of great beasts of prey. And he could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth, and the noises they made in the night, and dreaming there by the Yukon bank with lazy eyes blinking at the fire. These sounds and sights of another world would make the hair to rise along his back and stand on end across his shoulders and up his neck, till he whimpered low and suppressedly, or growled softly, and the cook shouted at him, "Hey, you Buck, wake up!" Whereupon the other world would vanish, and the real world come into his eyes, and he would get up and yawn and stretch as though he had been asleep. It was a hard trip. with the mail behind them, and the heavy work wore them down. They were short of weight and in poor condition when they made Dawson, and should have had a 10 days or a week's rest at least. But in 2 days' time they dropped down the Yukon bank from the barracks, loaded with letters for the outside. The dogs were tired, the drivers grumbling, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail, greater friction on the runners, and heavier pulling for the dogs. Yet the drivers were fair through it all, and did their best for the animals. Each night the dogs were attended to first. They ate before the drivers ate, and no man sought his sleeping robe till he had seen to the feet of the dogs he drove. Still, their strength went down. Since the beginning of the winter they had traveled 1,800 miles, dragging sleds the whole weary distance, and 1,800 miles would tell upon life of the toughest. Buck stood it, keeping his mates up to their work and maintaining discipline, though he too was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered regularly in his sleep each night. Joe was sourer than ever, and Sol-leks was unapproachable, blind side or other side. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong with him. He became more morose and irritable, and when camp was pitched at once made his nest where his driver fed him. Once out of the harness and down, he did not get on his feet again till harness up time in the morning. Sometimes in the traces, when jerked by a sudden stoppage of the sled or by straining to start it, he would cry out with pain. The driver examined him, but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his case. They talked it over at mealtime and over their last pipes before going to bed. One night they held a consultation. He was brought from his nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded till he cried out many times. Something was wrong inside, but they could locate no broken bones, could not make it out. By the time Cassiar Bar was reached, he was so weak that he was falling repeatedly in the traces. The Scotsman called a halt and took him out of the team, making the next dog, Sol-leks, fast to the sled. His intention was to rest Dave, letting him run free behind the sled, sick as he was. Dave resented being taken out, grunting and growling while the traces were unfastened, and whimpering broken-heartedly when he saw Sol-leks in the position he had held and served so long. For the pride of trace and trail was his, and sick unto death he could not bear another dog should do his work. When the sled started, he floundered in the soft snow alongside the beaten trail, attacking Sol-leks with his teeth, rushing against him and trying to thrust him off into the soft snow on the other side, striving to leap inside his traces and get between him and the sled, all the while whining and yelping and crying with grief and pain. The man tried to drive him away with the whip, but he paid no heed to the stinging lash, and the man had not the heart to strike harder. Dave refused to run quietly on the trail behind the sled, where the going was easy, but continued to flounder alongside in the soft snow, where the going was most difficult, till exhausted. Then he fell, and lay where he fell, howling lugubriously at the long train of sleds churned by. That is a great word, by the way. Absolutely amazing word. Oh, they don't have it? How can this be? All right, hold on a second. Lugubriously. I spelled it. A mournful, dismal, or gloomy, especially in an affected, exaggerated, or unrelieved manner. Lugubrious. Lugubrious. What a wonderful word. Then he fell, and lay where he fell, howling lugubriously as the long train of sleds churned by. With the last remnant of his strength, he managed to stagger along behind till the train made another stop. When he floundered past the sleds to his own, where he stood alongside Solex, his driver lingered a moment to get a light for his pipe from the man behind. Then he returned and started his dogs. They swung out on the trail with a remarkable lack of exertion, turned their heads uneasily, and stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised too. The sled had not moved. He called his comrades to witness the sight. Dave had bitten through both of Solek's traces and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. He pleaded with his eyes to remain there. The driver was perplexed. His comrades talked of how a dog could break its heart through being denied the work that killed it, and recalled instances they had known, where dogs too old for the toil or injured had died because they were cut out of the traces. Also, they held it in a mercy, since Dave was to die anyway, that he should die in the traces, heart easy and content. So he was harnessed in again, and proudly he pulled as of old, though more than once he cried out involuntarily from the bite of his inward hurt. Several times he fell down and was dragged in the traces, and once the sled ran upon him, so that he limped thereafter in one of his hind legs. But he held out till camp was reached, when his driver made a place for him by the fire. Morning found him too weak to travel. At harness-up time, he tried to crawl to his driver. By convulsive efforts, he got on his feet, staggered, and fell. Then he wormed his way forward slowly toward where the harnesses were being put on his mates. He would advance his forelegs and drag up his body with a sort of hitching movement, when he would advance his forelegs and hitch ahead again for a few more inches. His strength left him, and the last his mates saw of him, he lay gasping in the snow and yearning toward them. But they could hear him mournfully howling till they passed out of sight behind the belt of river timber. Here the train was halted. The Scotchman slowly retraced his steps to the camp they had left. The men ceased talking. A revolver shot rang out. The man came back hurriedly. The whip snapped. The bells tinkled merrily. The sleds churned along the trail, but Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of river trees. Oh, that, that's rough. That's rough, buddy. It's so hard because the harsh reality of the Alaskan winter is so rough on these amazing dogs that work so hard. Um, I can't even imagine with like modern technology and modern training, access to food and like sat phones and everything that our mushers have now. Oh, well, thank you. Thank you, Higara, so much for that. Um, we have like so we're in the midst of this particular festival called Fur Rendezvous, which is the like inaugural um beginning of the Iditarod, which for those of you that are not familiar with the Iditarod, it is a dog sled race from Anchorage all the way up to, I believe, Dawson City. That trek is completed. No, is it Nome? Bear with me. Wow. Okay. No. I did a road trail. Ah, here we go. Get a nice big picture. So from Anchorage to Nome, Dawson's on that trail, but all the way down here in, we don't need that. So down here in Anchorage, they go up the Eagle River, through Wasilla, through Knik, Skwetna, Yetna, Finger Lake, Rainy Pass, Nikolai. You can see Iditarod. Now, this journey was originally to bring medication. Like, they had no way to get the medicine safely to Nome because I believe there was a rash of fever, I believe. I don't know, I'm a little rusty in my Alaskan history, but there was this mad dash to get the medicine safely transported in these little glass vials. If you guys are familiar with the story of Balto, another famous sled dog, um, they had to rush from Anchorage all the way up to Nome to bring this medicine to the people there. And so these guys, are making that journey across. This takes weeks to go through these trails, absolute weeks to get all the way up through everything, because it's a long, long time distance. Alaskan history at its best. Yep, almost 1,000 miles. From, yeah. So the mileage for the historical, so it's 2,000 miles, if, depending on, because there and back again. It's an impossible race, and it's still held even today. The sled dog teams are like, you can hear them when they rush by. You during the inauguration, they have this. They in previous winters have had to actually bring in snow, but not this winter, into downtown Anchorage where they race the dogs out of the city. But yeah, it's technology has changed. Harnesses have changed. The sleds have changed. The quality and lightness of the materials, to from the tents to the sleeping bags to the clothing, the boots, has all changed. It's like a completely different game. They're finishing this trail in record time. Let's see, fastest time, 8 days, 3 hours, and that was several years ago. I don't think there's been anything that's come close to that. So, yeah, yeah, they the salmon's still probably a big part of most of these dogs' diets because most of Alaska, we subsist on salmon, so you can fill up your freezers with as much red salmon as you can catch. You can get a number of silver salmon, and you can get 2 king salmon a year. But most people just fill up their nets and their freezers with red salmon, and then for dogs, they usually catch chum or pink salmon, and they just freeze all of it, and then they just chop it all up and give it to them. Um, I was actually surprised to hear that they thawed out, because I've seen mushers just literally pull out chopped up salmon bits still frozen and give it to the dogs. They don't care. They'll just eat it. But yeah. Anyway, TMI, history about Alaska. But all of you wonderful listeners, I appreciate you guys stopping in today and listening. We're going to wrap it up here. I don't really want to start another chapter because we're already halfway through the book, and if I continue now, I won't have enough material for Friday. So I hope each and every one of you have a wonderful evening. Rest well. I hope you enjoyed the story. It was a little brutal at parts, and there was some language that I don't particularly approve of. Um, Yeah, I think we should find somebody nice to raid. Unfortunately, Fallen Thespian, you're not, streaming, and Waldosis isn't streaming. Let's see who's out there. Yes, I'm glad you enjoyed it, because I think this is the first time you've been on this side of the streaming. I've been following your work. Um, So let's see here. We can go to Twitch. Let's see. We've got a number of people. Let's see. Joel's doing some car gaming. Flats is playing some Overwatch. We could go watch ferrets be sleepy. Legends of Evantris. You don't know until you know. Don't worry about it. Let's see. Pren's doing Project Zomboid. Digital Vagrant's doing Pacific. A lot of VTubers. A lot of VTubers. Vil is drunk. Oh dear. Doing an Ask Me Anything. Segoy has a really interesting VTuber model. Has their tattoos move on their body. I've never seen anything like that before. Let's see. Harpy, Family Road Trip. Damien's doing a, what is this? Chilling on a Wednesday. I don't know. I think they're rating, well, I see Evil Dead, so maybe scary movies. A lot of people do. Oh, Bone Collar. Enough monkey business. Oh, he's playing Sirocco. Oh, that is such a cool game. Let's go visit Bone Collar.
It's not of Tuber stream until I've redeemed a TTS.
That's fair, Fallen. That's fair. I forgive me, but Fallen, you're involved with the development of the Biku bot, right? Or at least have been a product tester and have been using it for quite some time at the very least. Ah, you do tech support for it. Still, that's how I found you. So, well, it is what it is. Okay, let's go visit Bone Collar and watch him do cool fighty things with this amazing samurai. All right. All aboard. Choo-choo on the raid train. Also, I hope he talks about his model debut. He's got a new one that he's gonna show in the not so distant future. It'll be fantastic. So let's alley-oop.